Why doesn't the US have a high-quality, high-speed rail system? Oh, that's a loaded question. First, high-speed rail cannot run on the current tracks. Long-distance rail, yes. But bullet trains and the like cannot. They can't physically handle it, and the current lines are already busy with freight. The capacity isn't there. So with that, we'd need to build new rails. Okay, to do that, or similar organization would need to either buy or take billions of square feet of right-of-way. To assert the value of the right-of-way, a private appraisal is done on the entire property. And whether the government buys or takes, they have to pay the landowner, private or gov agency, for the loss. There will be lawsuits. And if all goes quickly, they take 15 years to resolve. That is a decade of work. Then we need to fork the work and build the trains and the track. Right now, we have an employee shortage. And some of the work requires specialized skills. Is it doable? Absolutely. Is it going to be difficult? For sure. Will we do it? Probably not. Right now, Americans as a nation generally don't have the fortitude or cohesion to produce the necessary multi-generational momentum. However, if we get it done regionally, I suspect the push to connect regions will increase. TLDR, it's not important enough to enough people. It's important to remember the U.S. has one of the most expansive and efficient freight rail systems in the world. Source: it is consistently ranked as one of the top 3 freight rail networks in the entire world. So the U.S. has a very rich history and present when it comes to rail and efficiency. It's not all doom and gloom. Unfortunately, high-speed rail, HSR, cannot run on the existing infrastructure, which would mean an entirely new infrastructure would need to be built. Don't forget, the existing infrastructure had a head start of 200 years plus terrible slave labor, so it will never be as easy and cheap as the old freight lines we see a lot today. We also have one of the most expansive highway systems in the world, as well as the most airports in the world by a very long shot. Over 13,000 airports. That means that any HSR system will need to compete with driving in a country with very low gas prices compared to others, as well as air travel in a country with cheap air travel and 13K airports that can take you anywhere. I can literally fly from San Francisco to Los Angeles on a last-minute ticket next week for $140 round trip. A new HSR system is going to be so insanely expensive that even subsidized prices would hardly compete with such convenience. A HSR ticket for a similar distance in Europe or Japan would be around $200 plus. The biggest HSR project in the United States right now is the project from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and it is an absolute train wreck, pun intended, of a project. The NYT has an excellent article here as to why the project is such a disaster and how it might have been better. The TLDR is that logistically, financially, and politically, it really won't ever make sense. However, small HSR connections, like say from Los Angeles to San Diego or Santa Barbara to Los Angeles, actually have a great chance of beating other methods of transport in terms of cost, convenience, and efficiency. Flying LA to SD is expensive and not worth it. Driving is bogged in crazy traffic. There is actually already a highly utilized train called the Surfliner that goes along the coast from Santa Barbara to San Diego. And even at slow speeds, many people will prefer it over flying. Basically, the entire HSR community warned California to walk before you run by just focusing on small but highly impactful HSR corridors rather than doubling down on SF to LA. A very challenging and long route for a first-time experiment in HSR. Imagine. A HSR ticket from SF to LA is currently estimated at about $200,300 per ticket and will take around 5 hours with no delay. The market for that is very narrow as it's far too slow for a work commute. And maybe about 1 hour longer than a flight if you include the entire trip from house door to house door. Whereas if you do LA to San Diego in 4,560 minutes, as opposed to the current 3-hour Surfliner, for $40 you suddenly open up a ton of possibilities for commuters. Maybe a rail pass to make it cheaper for daily commutes, and weekend travelers looking for an excuse to get a good California burrito or hit the bars in PB. Suddenly, a person living in San Diego can now realistically commute to a job 35 days a week in Los Angeles and back. That would unlock a ton of economic mobility and deliver powerful benefits to residents and even tourists in both of those cities. Anyway, there's a lot to unpack in answering that question, but I really hate when people blame corporate lobbying. People forget that HSR companies and construction workers exist too. And they can easily lobby just as hard. The NYT actually talks about a famous French bullet train company who lobbied for the California HSR contract, then actually pulled out because of how mismanaged the project was. Primarily politically but also feasibly. Corporate lobbying can definitely be partially blamed for many failures like lack of a decent subway in Los Angeles, but for something as broad as United States high-speed rail it's kind of a cop-out argument to avoid diving into the challenging details. So to a non-American it probably seems weird that we don't have a huge rail network for transport. Let me break it down. 1. The US is absolutely huge in terms of land area. And when you go west of the Mississippi there is a massive chunk fairly devoid of people until you hit the west coast itself. This means that long rail lines would services only a few stops between, say, Chicago and San Francisco or St. Louis and LA. Most people, both Americans and non-Americans, fail to appreciate just how devoid of people the western half of the US is. Until of course you hit the west coast. The result of this is that much of the mass travel between the eastern half of the Mississippi and the west coast, along with a splattering of urban areas in between. Las Vegas, for instance, are much better served by air transport, both in terms of convenience and economically. Think of it this way. At some 2,800 miles wide at its greatest extent, it would take incredibly long to go coast to coast by rail. 2. Extensive and expansive highway system. Millions of miles of concrete roads crisscross the U.S., providing easy personal travel from anywhere in the U.S., Canada and Mexico. 3. Corporate lobbying. The automotive and aerospace industries lobby hard to prevent rail expansion. The thing is, airplanes and cars are what killed rail in the U.S. in the first place. There is far less lobbying at a federal levels than people think. There is no need to. People in the U.S. chose car and plane over rail decades ago. 4. Current rail travel in the U.S. sucks. Unless you are on one of the nice East Coast Express trains. The rail network in the U.S. is probably the best and most extensive in the world. But it's for cargo, not people. Hope this helps. It does, depending on where you're looking. Keep in mind the US is much younger than Europe. Most of the cities were founded mid or post-industrialization, and many of them only really developed after the invention of the automobile. Notable too that the US is a very big place. If I pointed to New York's subway system, you might call me out on only providing one example, but New York City has a population rivaling some European countries. On the other hand, it's entirely impractical to have a rail system in a place like Wyoming, which has difficult terrain and has extremely low population density. Logistically, high-speed rail is more complicated than a lot of people make it out to be. If the destinations are too close, People will just drive. If the destination is too far, people will just fly. The US is much more spread out compared to Europe, China and Japan, so there aren't as many places where it would make sense to build high-speed rail. The larger area also means that there are more potential legal challenges if people object to a rail line being built through their property. In the US, there is also much more of a stigma against public transport, with a lot of people basically just seeing it as something for homeless people. That said, there are currently major projects underway in California, Texas, and probably a few other states that I am unaware of. Decades upon decades upon decades of successful lobbying by the automobile and oil industries to rebuild and maintain cities to keep Americans dependent on cars. Say I'm in Portland, Maine, and I want to go to my friend's farm in Tishomingo. Okay, imagine how many train tracks would have to crisscross the nation to make that efficient. And even after I arrive in Tish, I'm still going to need a ride 20 miles to his farm. I don't think you appreciate just how spread out the US is. Rail systems only work in extremely dense areas, or in places where almost nobody can afford a vehicle. C.e.g. India. Because people don't really want one. People don't need it or want it enough. High-speed train 125 mile per hour. Airplane 550 mile per hour. Business has run on the airlines and their efficiency. The US is huge. Do you really want to spend 20 hours to go ATL to SFO instead of 4? Now take into account that you can run more planes than trains on available tracks, and you have much more convenience and efficiency for business. Same reason they don't have high-speed reliable broadband. Government sold out to Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller, who had a lot of oil and needed people to buy it. Build cars, build highways, drill for more oil, repeat. In short, car and oil industry lobbying against them. Gestures vaguely at state of US and shrugs. Billions and billions of dollars in industry centered around everyone having a car would fail slowly. Local gas stations to oil companies. Local mechanics to car manufacturers. Lots of big money will keep the federal government from ever promoting a system that would kill the automotive and oil industry. Oil lobby and the highly profitable unit economics that the oil lobby is put in place to protect. Next question. 'Cause oil and car companies hate losing money. America is designed to sell cars. It would make less money to have a high-speed rail system.
We dumb.
Conservatives, they don't even want to maintain our roads and bridges. Lobbyists for airlines, autos, etc.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Ericast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.